It is my pleasure today. It is a rare occurrence in NSF world where we have a local resident who has deep insight into so many things that involve national security. And I have to say, Caleb Cage, many of you remember, Caleb spoke to us a year and a half ago, in his official capacity as Homeland Security Director for the state of Nevada. But perhaps Caleb's greatest gift is as a writer, and as a writer who gives us insight into things that many of us think we knew something about, but didn't really. Caleb is also, he comes from the perspective of having been a veteran and have served in Iraq on 2 tours. But his thoughts on war and the wars that we've been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, to me, are deeply moving and deeply touching and deeply insightful in ways that I hadn't thought about them before. So when he said, "Maureen, I have a new book," and he sent me a copy, and I started to read it, and I couldn't put it down. And I hope you will do the same, and I hope you will enjoy his presentation. But before Caleb joins us, I was very impressed that the foreword of the book is written by his father, Gary, who's going to open a little bit. And Gary is a philosopher, so when I opened the book and I started reading, I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I was very touched and excited and stimulated to hear how to put the stories of war in a perspective of narratives. So with that, Caleb, Gary, would you come up? I assure you, you will be in for a treat with this program, and I strongly recommend that you acquire the book. And afterwards, Caleb has a few copies with him that he'll be signing, and otherwise, I know for a fact it's available on Amazon. So with that, Gary, you're going to open.
Thank you, Maureen. A narrative is just a story. Usually involves a setting, usually a problem sort of thing, and then reaches a climax, and the story is best when there's a resolution to it, and we're all familiar with that sort of thing. Narratives can be provided. Someone can just tell you the story, but narratives can also be critiqued. One can ask, well, how much of this is supposed to be true? How much of it indeed is true? But narratives are also very important philosophically. That is, they have to do with how we understand the world. I have heard Caleb talk about these things that are in the book for about 10 years. But then the book came out. I sat down and read it, and I got to say, I was surprised because all 3 of those things were there. And the philosophical aspect was especially important to me. Let me just say that narratives are important. There can be narratives without truth. All you have to do is go to a movie. There can be narratives without truth, but there cannot be truth without a narrative. There's no such thing as raw, brute facts, not even in science. When a biochemist or a student in biochemistry enters the field, she steps in a stream that's already been flowing for many years. A stream of history, a narrative. She becomes a part of that narrative, promotes it herself. The same thing is true with all of us. All propositions are nested in narratives, in a nexus of values, and history, and truth. And so that's why narratives are so philosophically important. So I was very excited when I read this book. I'm excited to introduce or to present Caleb as our speaker. I might end with this one last phrase. Just as there's no truth without a narrative, neither is there wisdom without a narrative. I present to you Mr. Caleb Cage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning and present on war narratives, shaping beliefs, blurring truths in the Middle East. You know, there are a lot of people who work behind the scenes to put these programs together, and really appreciate all the work from Patty and Maureen and Randy and Cammie and Tim, who's videoing this here. And everybody who puts these events together. They really are special, and it's really something special and unique that we can have here in our community. I'm proud to be a part of this, and especially proud to be to follow my personal and intellectual hero, my father, who, as you heard from his presentation, that was kind of our dinner time conversation every evening. And so you can see why this gets a little dense here in a minute. I'm going to talk through the concepts as outlined in this book, and that's just a way for me to outline the thinking behind this so that I can really get to the meat of the argument of what I'm trying to say in this book. And I do that on a chapter-by-chapter basis. And so here in a few slides, I'll start going through the individual chapters and show how all of these things work together, hopefully to allow us to have a great conversation during the question and answer period that follows. So thank you once again for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to start with the problems of narratives. As you heard in the introduction, and all of that is covered in greater detail in the foreword to the book, narratives represent or make up a diversity of opinions about the war in Iraq. So not just a rhetorical question. Let me ask, what do you believe about the war in Iraq, the most recent war that began in March of 2003? How do you think about the war in Iraq? And what sorts of opinions do you hold, and how do those opinions align with your greater political or personal worldview? And the final question is, one set of opinions better than another set of opinions about the war? Are they equally valid? And the corollary to that is, one set of narratives more representative of the truth, capital T, objective truth about the war, and how do we identify that? As you heard from the introduction, this book is based on basically two basic assumptions. The first is that narratives are basically represent choices about facts, how we order those facts, what facts we emphasize in order to derive understanding and opinions and perspectives about the war or in general. The second assumption is that as narratives represent those choices, narratives very much drive our understanding of the war. They align with our political, personal worldviews, and they confirm our social and political beliefs. Very often, the narratives that we believe about things align with things that we already believe. I like to point out when I'm doing these presentations that if an event happens in Iraq and you turn on Fox News, you're going to get one perspective on that event. If you turn on MSNBC, on another cable news channel, you're going to get another perspective about that event. If you turn on CNN, you're going to get an even third perspective about that event. All of these are derived from the same factual events that occurred, but they are filtered or mediated in different ways. This is even further mediated by social media and the other ways that information and the information landscape is personalized for all of us. So why are narratives so powerful regarding Iraq? The first is, in my opinion, what I refer to as the civil, or what scholars refer to as the civil-military divide. This is the gap between the civilian public and the military that fights its wars. The all-volunteer military force, which started after the Hollow Force post-Vietnam era, to professionalize the military, had many tremendous values and benefits to it, to include creating an extraordinarily proficient, efficient, and deadly military. However, associated with that, in my opinion, is the result of an outsourcing of America's foreign policy to a very small portion of society, and therefore separating society even further from the military that fights its wars. The second is the mediated landscape that I just talked about earlier. Narratives are powerful because we can get the media, the information, the facts that we were talking about earlier, mediated to us through different media outlets that already align with our beliefs. Again, if you have a certain political viewpoint, you're going to watch you're more likely to watch a certain political outlet, or cable outlet that will align with your views and interpret views in ways that reinforce your worldview, the way you already believe about the world. The consequences of this are significant. Narratives allow us to be manipulated by those who wish to use them for political objectives, to drive political objectives. I think this is a huge consequence of narratives, and I'll get out of the theoretical side of this here in a minute, but narratives have the ability to drive us emotionally instead of logically towards foreign policy or military action that we may not otherwise be in support of. And I think the biggest consequence right now is if we do not challenge these narratives, we're going to very much continue down the road of going to wars like we did in the early 2000s in the future by being led down those paths using the same narratives or similar narratives that I would argue we're already seeing develop. So if a narrative drives our understanding of a war, and this is my argument here, and if narratives often or can often represent flawed understanding of those wars, then we are obligated to challenge the facts and refine them. And that's what this book attempts to do. I do not try to say these narratives are bad, here are narratives that are good. I simply say these narratives represent fairly unsophisticated perspectives about the war. Here are some nuances that challenge those narratives, and here are some alternatives that will help us to understand them better. So, this book is outlined. The first, it's each of these narratives here on this slide represents a different chapter. There are other chapters associated with it, but these are the major ones and the ones I'll talk about today. The first step, the first objective of this book was to identify the major narratives of the war. The second was to study how those narratives developed and what they were used for. And then the third was to identify what nuances and problems associated with those narratives might allow us to broaden our understanding and our perspective so that we can challenge the narratives that we hold. You can see on the left side of the screen, your left side of the screen here are 4 narratives. These are basically the first 4 narratives studied in the book, one per each chapter. And these are narratives that are at a very high level. These involve people whose names you know, like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush and Joe Biden and John Kerry and other people whose names are in the news. These are policy level narratives. They represent the way we understand narratives culturally and societally from the policy level. On the right side of the screen here are narratives that are more from the soldier perspective, the service member perspective, and they represent a more personal narrative. The book starts at the highest level. This was the George W. Bush administration, the narrative about the Bush administration's decision to go to war, the war of choice narrative, and they end at a most personal level, which are veterans writing about their experiences. The main argument, the so what of this book is that the truth is the capital T truth, the objective truth, the outcomes, the things that actually reflect what happened on the ground and are not just efforts to develop a legacy in some way, are towards the latter half of the book. In fact, I argue that the most true analysis coming out of these wars, or this war in Iraq in particular, is happening through fiction, and I'll get to that argument here in a moment. So as you can see from this slide here, I take each one of these narratives and I state what the narrative is. I analyze how it developed, what it was used for, how we can identify that narrative as a narrative and not something that reflects specific pursuit of the truth, but rather something that would be used for some sort of political outcome. And then I identified a set of books that represent the development of that narrative. So in this case, it's memoirs of the Bush presidency and the Bush administration team. Other times I looked at oral histories of soldiers or fiction written by service members and so on. So I'll dive right in here. The first narrative that I examine basically states, and I call it the war of choice narrative, it basically states George W. Bush engaged in a war of choice. Now, this is a significant point that has significant implications, and I know many of you have national security or diplomatic background, but a war of choice is a term of art. It's not just something that says we chose to go to war. It's very close to what some may consider war crimes and other things. These are wars of opportunity. They're aggressive acts by one nation against the sovereignty of another nation, and they do not. The war of choice does not align with what we call a war of necessity. In fact, there's a book called War of Choice, War of Necessity, where the author, Richard Haass, argues that the Iraq War in 2003 was a war of choice. The Iraq War in 1992 was a war of necessity, and he makes his argument for the difference between the two. This narrative works, and I talk about how we use narratives to manipulate politically. This narrative was largely levied against the Bush administration by his opponents, by his political enemies. And the argument was George W. Bush engaged in a war of choice. He did it on his own. There was nobody who supported him in this. This was his choice, therefore it is his war. And if it fails, the failure is at his feet. The Bush administration, I was surprised to find, throughout these different memoirs, also embraced the war of choice narrative. And there's an argument for why that would benefit them from a legacy perspective. But they also embraced the war of choice narrative through this, basically arguing we did what we had to do and history will judge us for that as they will. May be true, or it may be a part of their legacy development. The problem with this narrative is that it does not reflect the actual decision-making process that went into this. There was, and I think serious scholars would argue, that Congress absolutely abdicated its constitutional war powers by basically passing an authorization use of military force, AUMF, that said the president can do this if he wants, he can go to war if he wants, but it's on him. And that essentially was an abdication of their foreign policy and military war powers from a congressional standpoint. It's worthy of noting that AUMF that was passed in 2002 was used multiple times to justify multiple interventions over the next 17 years and was just retracted last week. Right. Literally just retracted last week. So the consequences of this use of this narrative were in 2006, Congress won back, or the Democrats won back support of control of Congress. Donald Rumsfeld was essentially fired. Gates came in and took over the Defense Department. We can see an actual practical example of how a narrative was used to drive political change and drive a political outcome. I'm going to start moving a little more quickly through these, but I wanted to delve a little more deeply into that so you can see kind of the thinking behind this. The second narrative I cover in chapter 3 of this book is what I call the cowboy narrative, and it builds on the war of choice narrative. It basically states George W. Bush engaged in a war of choice. He did it on his own, and he's exclusively to blame for that. That's the war of choice narrative. The cowboy narrative says that George W. Bush was willing to engage in total war. He was willing to do so unilaterally, and he didn't care about the cost. If you go back and look at the literature from this time, this was a major narrative that was used against the Bush administration, that there was this unilateral foreign policy, that Bush had this coalition of the willing that really represented, I think, 42 different nations that they were, whether or not they were allies or we had to purchase their support in some way. The problem with this narrative, once again, is that the Bush administration and Bush himself actually exhibited this narrative. You can go back and read his statements to the public, where he said things like that Osama bin Laden was wanted dead or alive, that he repeated the phrase "let's roll," which was, of course, part of the 9/11 attack, and so on. And you can see that his rhetoric was very much this cowboy rhetoric. It reinforced the perspective, it reinforced the narrative that President Bush was doing this on his own. I basically looked at a lot of the journalism, specifically the journalism of Bob Woodward associated with this, and saw that this was coming up time and time again throughout a lot of the journalistic literature. The consequences of this narrative reflect the fact that the president was talking about a total war. We're going to go to war. We're going to mobilize all the means of national power, and we are going to fight the enemy where they live, and we're going to do all of these things. But the fact was, the facts actually show that the war was fought in a much more limited fashion, that there was a huge emphasis placed on limiting casualties, limiting cost, and limiting exposure to the American people and the American public regarding this war. So one that was sold as a total war actually turned out to be a very limited war, and the consequences of this, of course, was it allowed the administration to not engage the American public in this war and not mobilize the American public during this war. The final narrative to come out of this section, again, out of the high-end policy area, is what I call the surge narrative, and it is definitely an outcome of the first two narratives. The war of choice narrative says President Bush went to war on his own, he's therefore to blame. The second narrative says that the Bush administration engaged in cowboy rhetoric in a total war, but the consequence was, of course, that they did not mobilize the American public in support of that. So the Bush administration found themselves in 2006 pursuing in 2007, pursuing what we call the surge narrative. And I state here that by 2006, this is the narrative, the situation in Iraq was so desperate that the U.S. could only be saved by a new hero and a new strategy. That hero who rose to the occasion, I say this somewhat sarcastically if you read the book, was General Petraeus. And that new strategy was the surge strategy, which was really not a new strategy beyond the number of troops that were brought in on the ground. You can see a telltale sign of narratives and when narratives are being used through this narrative here, or through this specific narrative, and that is they have a binary perspective. So in order for this narrative to take hold, you have to basically be in the Petraeus camp and against all of the generals who came before him, or be in the opposite camp where you are for Petraeus or for the generals before him and against Petraeus. That's obviously, or maybe to me, or at least to me, obviously a pretty unnuanced way of looking at that. All of these things are a continuum, and in fact, David Petraeus was one of the early generals of the war, as well as a later general of the war. So that binary narrative is flawed on its face. The problems with this, once again, are with this narrative, and you can see it developed through various works of journalism, Tom Ricks and others who supported it. The biggest problem with this is the key objective of the surge failed. The surge was intended to provide political space for the Iraqi government to get their house in order, for them to establish a government and begin to build a democracy on their own. The surge failed in that sense. The argument that General Petraeus came in as the hero of the war is flawed because COIN, or counterinsurgency, was well underway before the war even began. I've already been over the fact that General Petraeus was a general prior to, so the problems that he inherited, to include the death squads that had become a part of the Iraqi police, were problems that he had a hand in creating to begin with. I asked the question at the end of this, is it possible perhaps that this surge in Iraq was more of a domestic political victory than a strategic military victory? And by that I mean, were these narratives so effective in defeating President Bush this late in his presidency that he needed a way to win the support of the American people back, and so the surge was the best opportunity to do so? That's my personal opinion. That is a counter narrative presented in this book, and it is one that represents a very high cost for a political victory as far as lives and treasure are concerned. I'm going to skip to the very last one here so we can get to questions, and so Maureen doesn't have to pull me off the stage here.
You've got 5 minutes. You've got 5 minutes.
Got 5 minutes? Okay. So as I stated, in the latter half of the book, I looked away from the high-level political or policy narratives and started looking at how narratives impacted the younger, or not younger, but the soldier level, is service member level as well. And I wrote a chapter entitled "The Heroes and Victims." And the argument behind heroes and victims is, as a broader society, we view those who serve in the military in one of two camps. They are either heroes who come back and are deserving of our praise, or they're victims and they're coming back to our communities deserving of resources and pity. If you look at the oral histories associated with the war in Iraq, and this was written a few years ago, and there have been many more since then, the oral histories that are heavily edited, so the interview accounts of service members from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the oral histories that are heavily edited and synthesized reflect these narratives, which I argue are primarily politically conservative or politically liberal narratives. So they align with these political worldviews. But if you read the unedited, the books that make up transcripts of the service members returning, they don't talk about themselves in terms of heroes. They don't talk about themselves in terms of victims at all. They in fact, they reject those views completely in their interviews. They talk much more about experiences that may have given them some sort of growth, what we refer to in the broader veteran community as post-traumatic growth. The idea that these events may have been traumatic, but we can grow from them and gain wisdom from them over time. And so the problem or the consequence of this narrative, of course, is they really are about us as a broader civilian society, and they're not about the individual service members and their experience. And so it reinforces that civil-military divide. And I'll conclude on this, which is the last chapter before the conclusion of the book. And the narrative is, essentially, it's a literary narrative. It states that real wars, or the real war, whatever war that's referring to, cannot be reflected in literary fiction. This is an argument that in my reading was originally made by Walt Whitman, who, as many of you know, was a medic during the Civil War. And he basically said the real war will never get into the books. The idea that the experiences were so personal and so profound that books, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, can never reflect those experiences from his war, the Civil War. The great historian Paul Fussell, in his book Wartime, took that quote, "The real war will never get into the books," and wrote it more deeply into a great chapter in his book by that title, and argued that the experiential divide during World War II was so great between the civilian public and the military serving on the front lines that those wars could never be reflected or could never be captured in books. And he argues this is especially true of fiction, that works of fiction, for various reasons, can never tell the real story of what's going on. What I found in my reading of the books from Iraq and Afghanistan, written by civilian authors and military authors alike, was that these books actually reflected the truth of what was happening in these wars more personally and more profoundly than many or all of the supposed nonfiction books that had been written to further a legacy, to tell a story, to settle a score, as was so often the case, or to sell books, as was often the case. That these authors of literary fiction were not trying to necessarily tell a true series of events, but rather to explore truth as they understood it. These authors that I interviewed for this chapter explicitly said their work was intended to start a conversation to bridge the gap between the civilian and military public. They explicitly said that their work was intended to empathize with people whose experience may not be like their own, such as writing from the perspective of an Iraqi civilian, which you don't see a lot in the nonfiction works. And one said, this great quote, "Journalism is where we go to find the lies, fiction is where we go to find the truth." And I think that that is particularly true with these wars. If these wars are our first truly postmodern wars, then it is in keeping with that, it follows that the best way that we may find truth in these wars is through fictive accounts. So I'll conclude with that. Went a little bit over, but really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Took me quite a while to put this work together, and tried to cover it briefly there. So thank you very much, and thank you, Maureen.
Thank you. I think one of the reasons that I found Caleb's book so insightful is that I was actually in the Bush administration and working in the White House immediately post 9/11, and then through the entirety of the Bush administration. So much of what he talked about I found really resonated with me, talking about the stories that we heard, and some that we promoted, and some that we hated inside the administration. And one thing in particular I have to say, Caleb, you point out the victims and heroes. Let me say that in terms of what you wrote in this book, in my mind, for me, you're the hero. I appreciate your service, but more importantly, I appreciate your insight on your service. So really a fantastic insight. So questions came in late, so I need to look at them quickly. Let me start with a practical question. You talk about the narratives, and you do touch on this in the book. You talk about the narratives of the surge and the reconstruction and what happened there. From your perspective, are we missing something in the narrative that put DOD in charge of what should have been a civil society reconstruction? Was that a mistake, or was that part of the story we got caught up in?
So I think that was one of the chapters that I skipped in this presentation today, was about the reconstruction, and where some of these are, some of the chapters, in fact, all the chapters that I talked about this morning are somewhat critical of the Bush administration at the highest level. This one, I think, was a little more forgiving of the Bush administration at the highest level. The basic argument being, the narrative being, the belief being we did not have what we called a Phase 4 plan for the Iraq War. So Phase 3 was the invasion. Phase 4 was the reconstruction that followed. And if you look at that, the truth is we actually had a plan. We had dozens of plans, and that was the problem. We had so many plans about the reconstruction, and the plans were constantly being rewritten and re-evolving over time, that it basically amounted to having no plan at the end of the day. But if you talk to people in the State Department or USAID or the Defense Department or any of these agencies that were involved, they'd say, oh, yeah, we have a plan. I could point to you where it is on the shelf right now. But who was coordinating these plans? Who was bringing these plans together? And what I found fascinating in doing the research on this chapter were two things. One is the number of books about Phase 3, the invasion. You and I couldn't count them if we took all of us together and spent all day doing it. There are just countless books about the invasion. The number of books about Reconstruction, about Phase 4, probably under 10 books that have been written about that. Not surprising from a marketing perspective, but surprising to me that there was that little focus on what was essentially the hardest problem of the Iraq War. The second thing that surprised me, I think gets to your point, Maureen, and that is the fighting between state and defense over who would own the $18 billion in reconstruction aid was probably one of the most disastrous things that could have happened following only second to Ambassador Bremer releasing the anybody who was a Ba'athist and getting rid of the military through his orders, his general memorandum. So I believe that the fighting and bickering between the State Department and Defense was a huge setback, wound up costing huge numbers of lives and billions of dollars, if not more. So I think that's kind of a 50,000-foot answer to your question, but I think that's probably the part that we're missing is the Rumsfeld-Powell battling and later Rumsfeld-Rice battling that really made this recovery or reconstruction impossible.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me move to something more personal. Several questions about what your motivation was for writing the book and how did your personal experiences during your tenure in Iraq really inform the way you saw these different narratives?
Great question. I think I write in general. This is my third book, all of which have been on my experiences in Iraq or have been associated with the Iraq War. I write to make sense of things, and where my book before this was a work of fiction, where I got to again explore some of these things with a different without the barriers of truth because I'm writing fiction. In this book, I really wanted to explore what got us into this situation where we were fighting a war in Iraq and later or earlier than that or simultaneously with that a war in Afghanistan. What got us into this situation? What kept us there? And what can prevent us from going down this road in the future? If I had one motivation, if there's one thing I hope to accomplish with this book, it's to point out some of the flawed thinking and political manipulation that allowed us as a country to pursue these wars so that we can see that as a framework for assessing how important a war might be in the future, what the costs of that might be, and therefore what our national investment should be. I am for the use of military force. I just think it should be done right, and that's with congressional approval, that's with national support, and that's with ways of paying for it without mortgaging future generations and current lives.
Excellent. Thank you. Gary, this one is for you, and it comes to the issue of truth, which you alluded to. Objective truth, whatever that means, seems to be incredibly elusive. So if you are a consumer, as we all are, a consumer of information from news sources to books to literature to everything that we're exposed to, how do we find our way through this collection of stories and narratives and find some truth in the aspect of what we are reading? So to the philosopher. Yeah.
Well, that's my wheelhouse. Spend my life in that. Is this on? Yeah.
Just hold it close.
Okay. Sorry about that. briefly stated, the more information that you can garner and the more that you can critique it, always be willing to hear arguments opposed to what you might think, constantly challenge yourself. I believe that truth is absolute. We're probably seldom absolutely certain about it. And so it's a constant job in our lives to assess the truth. We have to be willing to change our minds. But we have to believe there is such a thing as truth. If we don't, then that ball game is over. But it's a lot of hard work. So it's information and skills in critiquing that information. That's briefly put.
Excellent. Thank you. And for a philosopher, that was a pretty short answer, I have to say. Especially on something as ubiquitous as truth. Back to Caleb. How an insightful question about how were these narratives that were arose around the war in Iraq and Afghanistan influenced by the war in Vietnam?
That's a great question. How were they influenced by the wars in Vietnam? I think the most obvious one to look at and kind of show how this may have carried out throughout was what I call the war of choice narrative. And the first one that basically Bush's critics, President Bush's critics basically said the president engaged in a unilateral war of choice. I believe that the reason why that Congress allowed that to happen and why we allowed Congress to do that was directly related to Vietnam. And I get into the rise of the all-volunteer military in that chapter and talk about how post-Vietnam there was this hollowing of the force following this downsizing of the military, following the draft. The military was in a very, very, very critical situation. Ty Cobb was being promoted in that army, and I mean, this is how desperate it was. And in our home, you only mock those you love. I hope you know that. So it was a very critical time, a desperate time in the military, and the military said, we need to professionalize the military. In order to do that, we need to have an all-volunteer force, and we need to do away with the draft. And these are the things associated with that. I think that lesson from Vietnam was an important lesson, and it was an important policy question, important policy lesson. I'm not an advocate of the draft, but I do believe that it did have that. Removing the draft had huge implications on the way we essentially outsourced the war in Iraq to the military instead of as a nation. The second would be, I think that the Heroes and Victims chapter speaks to, I think, a national memory of how people, our service members, were treated coming back from Vietnam. And I heard this as an Iraq War veteran, regularly people saying, we're not going to do that to our service members this time. We're going to support the troops this time. I think it's very well intentioned, and it was a reaction to Vietnam. I think I'm just look at the implications of that as well.
Excellent, thank you. Back to some very specific things. You in the book you go through and you reference lots of different books that you draw from in these stories. So we have questions specifically on two, Tom Rick's book, Fiasco, and The Things They Left Behind. So
I don't know. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, the question is really, how do these books fit into those narratives? When do they fit into the narratives? Are they books that form the narratives, or are they books that reinforce them? And then of the things where you really do conclude at the end that fiction is a window to the truth, What are some of the things that books that you recommend of the fiction writers?
Great, thank you for the question. So Tom Rick's Fiasco was probably one of the most important books in establishing the surge narrative. This idea that the war was lost by the end of 2006, all is lost. We need a new general and a new strategy to come in. Enter David Petraeus and the Surge, and they're going to save us from all of this. That was very much a part of Fiasco. It was also a part of a book called Tell Me How This Ends. There's a number of books, and I'm drawing a blank on the other two right now. But these books that I referenced, I try to reference them not just gratuitously to say these books were also about the Iraq War, but to show how they contributed to creating the narrative and how they took a different. Fred Kaplan's book takes a different look at the surge narrative, although he promotes it. He begins his book, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, but Kaplan begins his book saying, this is not a study of how holy and wonderful David Petraeus is, like has been done before. This book came after Fiasco and Tell Me How This Ends and All In, the book about Petraeus. But then it goes on to embrace many aspects of that narrative. All four of those books also, by the way, concede that the fundamental objective of the surge, creating that political space for the Iraqi government, was a failure in the end, which in my opinion is a huge reason to critique that narrative to begin with. As far as the fiction is concerned, the things they carried, Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, was a phenomenal book that really kind of set the standard for literary fiction following the Vietnam War. There are a number of books that I think Fields of Fire that really did this for the Vietnam War and I think contributed to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I think the really interesting thing about the Iraq and Afghanistan era fiction is how unsanitized it is. These books are grueling to get through. Some of them, I'm thinking about Kevin Powers' The Yellow Birds, Matt Gallagher, who's a Reno native, also, and a good friend and a wonderful author, probably one of the most important authors of this war. His multiple books, including Youngblood and of course, Redeployment, and the books that I cover in the book, 11 Days, and We Are Called to Rise. There's just so many of them. But I think the really significant part of it is they don't shy away from the hard truths that we're not seeing on the news and that we're not seeing in journalistic accounts.
Excellent. Thank you. Back to the victims and the heroes chapter. Clearly, the issue of PTSD has been introduced into society post-Vietnam, right? So not necessarily just in these wars, but it seems to have come to a forefront, come to a major focus of what happened to people who were deployed. And one thing I found inspiring in your chapter is this notion, as you phrased it, post-traumatic personal growth. Where are we? The perception when we listen to the news seems to be that everybody who returns from the war is suffering some trauma that makes it impossible for them to adjust into society. What is the counter narrative, and where are we in the truth about PTSD?
So, great question. Multiple layers to that. I think the overall question of where are we, I would answer by saying we're nowhere if we're not challenging that narrative that everybody who returns is broken. I think that is a debilitating narrative societally. I think it's debilitating to the people who are returning, and I think it's more about us as a broader society than it is about those who are returning. I know a lot of folks. I served with a lot of folks. I worked in the veterans world for a long time. Very, very seldom do you hear somebody refer to themselves in terms that are associated with victimhood. I think that what we've seen following this war, probably perhaps because of that, is people who are more willing to embrace the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. I will tell you something I don't talk about often. I was a denier that it was even a thing for several years getting out of the military, that it was even a condition, that this was just something that people lean on as an excuse or whatever. I've come to believe, based on personal experiences and experiences with friends and people who are very close to me, that it is absolutely a real thing. And scientifically, it could be depending on your narrative, it could be, you could make a case for it as a real thing, I believe. However, we don't make any gains as a society. We don't address any of these problems if we're simply saying, you're broken, these terrible things happen to you, and you don't have to be responsible for or accountable for any of your behaviors going forward. I don't think that does anybody any favors. And I think that the people I've worked with over the years in the military and veteran world, they don't see themselves that way, and they actually see their military experience, no matter how traumatic it may have been, as something that is fundamental to their identity and as something that is fundamental to who they are as a member of society.
Excellent. Spoken as only a veteran can speak, I assure you. But that's very helpful to hear your perspective. Question for both of you. You talk predominantly about World War II, but you also, about Iraq, but obviously the concept that narratives grew extensively came out of World War II for a lot, and prior to that. But in the time that the government was fighting the war, and particularly in the post-reconstruction of Japan in particular, there was an attempt to understand the culture so that the narrative could be more positive moving forward. So I'm going to ask both the philosopher and the veteran, do we have that positive narrative about the culture in Iraq and Afghanistan that allows us to move forward, as we did in rebuilding Japan, in reconstructing the Marshall Plan in Germany? Philosopher first.
Well, that's a question pretty much outside of my field. You know, philosophers are very important, it's just that they never sound like it. I think the wars since World War II have been very, very different. They've been marginal in our lives in a lot of ways, where World War II was our lives. And no, I don't think that we have that positive narrative, and we don't concentrate on it very much. In fact, we've been allowed to marginalize these wars in our lives and go on with our daily business.
So I think one of the differences would be, you referenced Japan and World War II, and I think one of the critical differences is there was an institutional racism and demeaning of the Japanese people in World War II. It's been widely documented through posters and through propaganda and so on, following or during the war, and there are all kinds of sociological and psychological reasons that this was happening. I don't see that happening at an institutional level. Certainly there are instances of it maybe at a personal level, but I don't see that sort of othering happening of the Iraqi people at an institutional level, at a governmental level, at a military level, and that sort of thing, which I think is a very positive thing. I think when I was a platoon leader there in 2004, there was a huge emphasis put on cultural awareness of communication, of respect, of empathy for the people we were there to secure their communities. This gets back to the main argument of the book, or at least to the concluding argument of the book, and that is, if you read works like Matt Gallagher's Youngblood, he actually, and he talks about this in the interview, he actually wrote that book to make it so an Iraqi civilian. The story behind this is that there's one community where multiple military units have rotated in over years and years and years, but the community remains the same in this Iraqi town. And he's trying to show provide a way for a civilian who maybe doesn't have experience in Iraq during war to empathize with that local and say, well, how would you feel if a foreign army was camped out in your community for a decade or two, and that they had to relearn the same lesson every year as a new unit came in, and so on. I think we're starting to see that sort of thing again back in literature. Now, there are journalistic accounts. I think of Nir Rosen's In the Belly of the Green Bird, I think is the name of it, a phenomenal book which is very much written by an American author from the Iraqi perspective, and others. But I think it's different than World War II, again, it's not an institutional, but I don't think we've gone the full direction of saying the full path of saying, how do we understand this from an Iraqi perspective so we can see what's going right and what's going wrong?
Excellent. Let me end with a question to both of you again, and this is looking forward. You give us a lot of perspective of narratives and how they shape our beliefs, or how our beliefs shape what narratives we choose to engage with. There are lots of narratives out there right now. So looking forward, to Caleb, looking forward, how do we learn from these narratives that you very artfully describe pertaining to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as we look forward to potential future military engagement? Iran, Venezuela, pick a place. I don't know. I haven't seen the news in 10 minutes. And then to Gary, how do we keep our sanity moving forward with this plethora of stories and know and understand how we really can contribute helpfully to understanding the situations? To Caleb.
So as far as what this study intends to do for future wars, I would say we need to demand as a public. We need to demand that the government involve us in the nation's security, and that means we need to have some engagement, some skin in the game, whatever you want to call it, so that these wars are not just things the military handles, but things that we agree to do as a society. What I think that will do is, again, that's a dream world, because I don't think we're actually it's going to take something tremendously significant for us to get there as a society again. But I think what that will do was that actually prevents wars in the long run. It makes it harder to go to war. It makes it so we have to get the entire nation, or at least a majority of the nation, behind that war, as we did in World War II and previously. And I think it requires the government, especially Congress, to actually do things like declare wars instead of doing authorization of use of military force or allowing the president to use executive war powers, as we've seen. The last war that was declared by the United States was World War II. And Congress declared it. They had specific objectives. It's just crazy to me how many wars we've fought since then without congressional authorization. The other thing, what we can do is start to look at the news I know that's why you're all here. Look at the news from a critical perspective. And when everybody is getting into a fever pitch about a war, stop and ask yourselves, is this in our nation's best interest? What are the potential outcomes of this? And what are we willing to sacrifice as a nation in order to do this? I think those are the questions that we have to ask to prevent these sorts of small wars, they call them, from continuing going forward. It's very easy to engage if you believe, as Donald Rumsfeld did, that we have the most technically advanced military in the world and we can win just because of that. It's very hard to engage if you believe, as Colin Powell did, that we need to maximize the use of military force and only do so when our nation's interests vital interests are on the line. I think that we have let our war institutions out of the control of the American public and out of the control of this democracy, and we need to be very skeptical about future use of military force.
Thank you.
One of my favorite philosophers was Charles Schulz, the cartoonist of Peanuts. One day Snoopy was on top of his doghouse typing, and Charlie asked him, what are you writing? He says, it's a book on philosophy. Oh yeah, what's the title? Have you ever considered that you might be wrong? I believe there's a way to maintain sanity, and that way is reason. And we have to be open to the fact that we could be wrong. One of the most unhealthy things we could ever do is buy into a tribal narrative. We must always critique our narratives. That doesn't mean that we never arrive at truth or that we can't be confident about a narrative. In fact, the opposite is the case. We're confident when we have considered the possibility we might be wrong and that we have critiqued it. That's where the sanity is. The insanity comes when we find that our narrative that we have trusted so dearly is in fact wrong.
Well, with that, thank you both for a stimulating program.